Welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Courtney Nelson, your president-elect of City Club. Welcome to the members and guests who are gathered here today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with those of you listening along on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Eco Northwest, Chevron, Girding Edlin, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. Next week's Friday Forum will focus on the question, can we respond to climate change and build transportation infrastructure? Joining us on stage will be Andrea Durbin, the Executive Director of Oregon Environmental Council, along with Tom Kelly. Jefferson Smith will moderate the conversation. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, PDXCITYCLUB.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. After today's speech, I will facilitate a Q&A session with those in the live audience. Asking a question is a privilege of anyone who has a City Club membership. But anyone here in the live audience may write a question on one of the index cards found at the center of the tables. Hold the card up and City Club staff will collect them before or during the Q&A session. If you're not yet a member and decide that your question needs to be asked at the microphone to do it justice, go ahead and then just sign up your membership form at the end of the meeting. And now for today's program. Should colleges be required to provide notice of potentially upsetting material to course syllabi? The reason for adding a disclaimer is to let students know that the material they are about to engage in might be reminiscent of past traumatic events, distressing emotion, and high anxiety. The goal is to alert students about books and material content such as sexual abuse, violence, and death. Our speaker, Roger Porter, professor of English and Humanities at Reed College, is opposed to offering these trigger warnings. He will discuss his point of view referencing a course he taught on the novels of Philip Roth. He'll give a brief history of the movement, address his ideas on what may have led to the idea behind trigger warnings, as well as give the grounds of his opposition and resistance. Please join me in welcoming Professor Roger Porter to Friday Forum.
Thank you very much, Courtney. I'm delighted to be here. This is a talk which has elicited a great deal of interest in the academic world, and you may know the cliche about the academic world. People get very excited about things because the stakes are so low. When Caitlin Badgett, one of the best students I ever had at Reed College, asked me to speak at the City Club on the subject of trigger warnings, I was both honored and a bit apprehensive because while I certainly have objections to them, and I'll speak about them, as Courtney said, in a moment, I'm going to be speaking about the academic implications of such a phenomenon, and I realize that the issues are not merely academic or abstract, but profoundly psychological. But I'm a college professor in an English department and not a professional psychologist, and I have no direct experience with traumatic stress disorder or with the therapy involved for those who have suffered re-traumatizing because of exposure to words or images that triggered a recurrence of the original trauma. So you'll understand if my experience and remarks are largely directed to the classroom and not to the theory or practice of the therapist's office. I want to frame this talk on trigger warnings in part through my experience at Reed with a specific course, one that I taught in the past semester on the verge of retirement, a course on the novels of Philip Roth, where my concern about trigger warnings were front and center. I thought long and hard, so I'm going to be speaking somewhat autobiographically about this. I thought long and hard about what I would teach in my last course at Reed, and it seemed to me that the subject matter of that course would, if only for myself, constitute some kind of statement. I wanted such a course to be one that I had not taught before, and one that was engaging me for exactly the reason that I would be confronting material for the first time. Most of my critical writing has been on the subject of autobiography and memoir, and I have given many courses on that subject. I've also taught Shakespeare and modern fiction and modern drama. But I didn't want any of those subjects this time, or others that I had taught. I decided that I would give this course because in the previous year I had taught one novel of Roth's, The Human Stain, a novel about a black man who passes as a Jew, and it seemed to me to go over extremely well to a considerable student enthusiasm. In my estimation, Roth is probably, along with, say, Toni Morrison, the greatest living American novelist, and it occurred to me that I might teach a semester on Roth alone, giving students a sense of how a significant contemporary writer's vision, style, and values have developed over the course of a career, though I could only teach a fraction of Roth's some 30 novels. In addition, Roth had recently declared that he had retired, a very strange thing for a writer to say. Writers usually do that without making a public issue out of it. But nevertheless, he said it, and since in a much humbler way I was about to retire myself, I thought, why not, as it were, combine our waning energies? There was another reason, to be sure, though I tried to keep this to a minimum in justifying the course to students. Roth and I are only 3 years apart in age. We were both born in Newark, New Jersey, in fact, in the same hospital. We are both cultural Jews, crucial to his fiction, and we went to high schools in adjoining Jersey towns, Elizabeth and Newark. It also turns out, anecdotally, that my mother and Roth's mother often sat in adjoining hair dryers at the same beauty parlor, where in 1968, Mrs. Roth whispered to Mrs. Porter about her son's, that is Mrs. Roth's son's, recently published scandalous Portnoy's complaint. She said, "I wish Philip had written it in Yiddish so the Goyim wouldn't understand." But there remained a serious problem when I thought about offering the course. Roth is a writer who arouses passionate responses, and often, however mistaken I believe them to be, many readers perceive him and his writing as misogynistic, sexist, and egocentric. Few writers have managed to elicit both critical acclaim and skepticism, even disgust, to such a degree. Of course, there is the notorious sexuality of Portnoy's complaint that breeds what we might call the Portnoy reader's own complaint. And when I told the dean of faculty at Reed that I was giving such a seminar on Roth, the dean's office braced for an onslaught of student grievances and protests. Of course, deans are paid to worry about such matters, and they inevitably prepare for the worst. They forget, of course, that students these days swim in a culture of nonchalance about what used to be called dirty words, and that what shocked early readers of Roth is pretty small potatoes now. Even the famous moment, and you'll excuse me for referring to this, in Portnoy's complaint where the young and sex-starved Alex Portnoy, it was the 50s after all, in protest against his classic Jewish mother's surveillance and hovering, masturbates into a slab of raw liver that the family is preparing to have for dinner that night. This ceases to shock contemporary undergraduates. And so I reasoned, Reed students, hardly overly delicate and innocent creatures, would see the grotesque hilarity in such moments. There was, however, another and perhaps even larger problem. the trigger warning phenomena. It might not be necessary to define that phrase. Many, if not most of you, perhaps are familiar with this trend, which has swept educational institutions across the country in the last several years, and has landed at Reed College in a way that I and almost all of my colleagues have deplored. Early this year, the Reed Facebook pages were jammed with arguments about the phenomenon, essentially setting current students and very recent graduates against alumni who had been out for roughly more than 5 years. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the phrase and the concept, let me say right away that trigger warnings have nothing to do with gun control. At the heart of the trigger warning movement is the insistence that the classroom be a safe space. Such a desire has taken several different forms, but most commonly, it pertains to a request, sometimes a demand, that faculty members alert students when an argument from a book might possibly disturb or make the students uneasy, even triggering a re-traumatizing experience. These students are asking to be pre-notified about any reference in a course, such as a novel or a play, even from any historical period, that some individuals might find offensive, objectionable, disturbing, or personally troubling. In the extreme instances, even material that could challenge their values and beliefs. It used to be that such warnings were issued so that students who are survivors of sexual assault could decide to avoid material that might trigger debilitating reactions. But trigger warnings have expanded widely and might be urged for virtually any kind of disturbing content. What kinds of subjects might do that, according to students who have advocated such forewarnings and signs of danger ahead? Amongst the categories are passages depicting or simply mentioning rape, sexual assault, including behaviors of gods in mythological works, physical and emotional abuse, pedophilia, self-injurious behavior in not just suicide, but even eating disorders, gun violence, terrorism, swearing, shaming and slurring, graphic depictions of brutality, including discussions of war, even in Shakespeare, or Toni Morrison's great novel, Beloved, scenes of that sort having to do with slavery, descriptions of corporal punishment. Also, arguments that a character in a novel, not necessarily the author, might advance in favor of racial, ethnic prejudice or intolerance, colonialism, religious persecution, descriptions of slavery, violence against animals, references to death and dying, injury, oppression, marginalization, racism, sexism, disparagement of cultures different from or the same as one's own, or disparagement of genders different from or similar to one's own. One might be tempted to say life itself. Particularly egregious instances of the movement occurred when one university informed its professors that students reading the great Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe's celebrated novel, Things Fall Apart, could cause student despair by triggering readers who, quote, have experienced racism, colonialism, religious persecution, violence, and more. At Columbia University, students objected to reading Ovid's first-century Roman poem Metamorphosis because it contained, quote, instances of assault. Columbia initially plastered warnings on the poem, and then they purged it entirely from their reading lists. Rutgers University students wanted The Great Gatsby to have warning labels alerting readers to scenes that reference gory, abusive, and misogynistic violence, as if such novels were so many packs of cigarettes with warning labels by the czar of sanitized literature. Lolita, Nabokov's great satiric novel of pedophilia, certainly would not make the cut in many institutions. This truly, to me, seems like a distressing moment in higher education. And though the terms are different, it can feel like a throwback to earlier days of suppression, censorship, bowdlerizing, and blue laws. Think of high school librarians who not so long ago wanted to eliminate Huck Finn from the shelves, or high school parents who demand that their children be protected from books with ideas with which they disagree. Let me tell you for a moment, anecdotally, about my first encounter with such a thing at Reed that was really quite shocking to me. I was teaching a play by Shakespeare, Measure for Measure, and there's a very stunningly dramatic scene in which a nun goes to the Duke and pleads for her brother's life. Her brother has been sentenced to death for getting his fiancée pregnant before marriage. There's a newly involved capital punishment in this play, put in by the Duke, and the nun goes to plead for her brother's life. And in two very dramatic scenes, he proposes in a way that is that's filled with misunderstandings. He proposes to save her brother's life if she will sleep with him. Being a nun, she really doesn't quite get it, and it's a very terrifying scene. I had a student who, at the end of the course, when students typically write evaluations of their professors, the student said this was the most outrageous experience she had ever had in education, simply to read this passage, let alone to write a paper on it. I asked the students to write about the rhetoric and the psychology of this particular scene. She became incensed and outraged. She said, this scene introduced an inflammatory concept. Well, yes, that's what Shakespeare often does. And she said the scene triggered to survivors of sexual abuse content that was offensive, and I resented having to read it, let alone to write a paper about it. So that was my first experience with this kind of thing, which really raised red flags for me when I taught the next semester the course on Philip Roth. The problem, one that has occurred at Reed in a variety of courses across the humanities and the social sciences curricula, is symptomatic of a trend in the country at large. You might ask where such a movement originated. Most folks who have thought about the phenomenon are convinced that the call for trigger warnings began in the blogosphere, largely on certain feminist sites, as a caution against graphic depictions of rape, domestic violence, self-harm, and suicide. But as I've said, the desire for trigger warnings has in recent years expanded from those spaces into academic and even the broader public discourse. I hope it will not sound too trivializing or smarmy to say that I am a great lover of comfort food, but not of the comfort classroom. Education, in my opinion, should be a mode of disruption, a questioning of safe, predictable, conventional, and simplistic ideas, an examination of values that we take too easily for granted, of thoughts and approaches to situations, whether ethical, political, social, or psychological, that challenge our expectations and our grounded assumptions, however discomforting they may be. Of course, student proponents of trigger warnings are justified in wanting classrooms to be places where they will be free from bullying or name-calling, places where they feel guarded against intimidation of any kind. But proponents of trigger warnings seemed to want more. In some cases, students have asked not merely to be notified in advance so they could prepare themselves and not be blindsided by distressing material. In some cases, students wanted nothing whatsoever to appear on a syllabus that might create anxiety, a situation which I think we are within our rights to call a form of censorship, a chilling potential threat to academic freedom in a professor's choice of course materials. And needless to say, it raises specters regarding the history of banned and burned books. What used to be the purview of the religious right, think of, say, the Index, has apparently been taken over by elements of a hyper-politically correct left, if that is even the right term to use for it. College creates an opportunity for students to be exposed to views that are unfamiliar, to beliefs that might question and even contradict deeply held opinions. College is a place and a time when a student's world expands and becomes enlarged, where provocative points of view push against received ideas. To resist or reject the opportunity to engage in challenging dialogue, to criticize and defend ideas, is a denial of what it means to get an education. What are some other objections to trigger warnings? Their use assumes that individuals will necessarily respond negatively to certain content. It has furthermore been shown that triggers can provoke a response from a student he or she might not necessarily have had, or that they can imply that certain specific responses are expected from readers. They inevitably establish a focus on a single aspect of a book and not on others that can be equally, if not more, significant. A document written by professors of English and theater put it well. Faculty cannot predict in advance what will be triggering for students. Flashbacks, panic attacks, and other manifestations of past trauma can be triggered by innocuous things, a smell, a color. And a psychiatrist, the wife of a colleague of mine at Reed, recently wrote, quote, "Someone who has been raped by a man in a yellow shirt at a bus stop might start avoiding bus stops and perhaps anyone wearing yellow. Since triggers are a contagious phenomenon, there will never be enough trigger warnings to keep up with them," end quote. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a serious medical condition, best treated by trained professional therapists, not faculty members. Individual students can always seek individual accommodation, but to say that an approach to provocative reading should fit everyone in the same way seems wrong. And again, though I am no psychiatrist, I would think that structuring the academic world largely to accommodate this kind of concern allows students or prevents students from working through and grappling with their fears and from overcoming them. While no institutions of higher education, so far as I know, have instituted blanket policies demanding their faculty provide such trigger warnings, though Oberlin College has considered such policies, in fact, I think they still are, many places have responded to student demands by providing so-called safe spaces for these students, spaces where they can retire to if the classroom becomes too distressing. The New York Times reported recently on such a place in such a way that makes one believe that students are being reduced to vulnerable victims rather than persons fully engaged with works whose very purpose might be to raise difficult issues and questions. One such safe space at Brown University, of all places, a refuge for students exposed to triggering comments in works assigned in courses, is equipped with cookies, coloring books, Play-Doh, pillows, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies. This is nothing, to me, this is nothing less than self-infantilization. As the New York Times writer Judith Shulvitz argues, once you designate such spaces as safe, you imply that the rest of the world is unsafe. No one would condemn the desire and need for safety, but if the classroom is to be a therapeutic and protected space, it cannot be a challenging intellectual one. Colleges are not intellectual and emotional safe zones, nor should they be. Again, we all want to keep out of the classroom racial insensitivity, stereotyping, or interactions which might prevent one from interacting with other students. But studying difficult phenomena might well generate real discomfort and therefore could prevent important discussions from taking place. Trigger warnings not only regulate how words and images will be responded to, they ultimately narrow what one is exposed to. Finally, I would say that while the feminist movement of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s importantly advocated for strong, independent, autonomous women, women who would be powerful and assertive, this phenomenon seems quite different. When certain groups demand to be protected by triggers, it serves to promote a perception that they are weak and vulnerable, not strong. So given all of this, how, I wondered, would Roth's novels, concerned as they are with racism, all forms of sexual desire, violence, murder in the context of Vietnam War protests, fare in my class? Novels dealing with darker human impulses, the pain that encroaches upon human relations, experiences which undermine our sense of certainty and security, novels which deal with the body in decay, the ravages of age, the surprises and dread of the unforeseen that befall everyone, against which we have minimal resistance. As I was worrying this matter, one day I mentioned to my lawyer that I was thinking of giving a course on Roth, and he, a great aficionado of Roth, asked if he could sit in on the classes. I replied banteringly, though with some seriousness, yeah, you can audit the class, but only if, in the event that a student brings a harassment suit against me, you will defend me pro bono. My lawyer friend came to every class in the semester, and I wondered if he thought I really did need protecting, and he contributed as thoughtful as any student. As I will show, the students in this class, much to my surprise and delight, made my concerns about possible discomfort with Roth's writings, let alone the harassment suit, entirely unnecessary. But initially, a tad nervous about that the entire course might be a trigger warning, I decided to deliver on the first day not only a few general remarks about Roth's power and importance as a writer, but a preemptive argument against trigger warnings. I don't know if I can claim that this statement was responsible for the intellectual and literary sophistication of my students and how they confronted this brilliant, complex, and often disturbing writer, but it probably did not hurt. So let me give you a couple of excerpts from this screed that I gave to my students the first day in class. As I say, I don't know whether it worked or not. This is what I said. The course examines free expression in a writer and how we respond to it. Unfettered expression is essential on college campuses, as it is for any writer's freedom to say things that people might not want to hear. Just as in any intellectual environment, speakers must have the right to say the unsayable, so writers may write the unthinkable or even the unmentionable and challenge the seemingly unchallengeable. Freedom of expression provokes a forum for the provocative, the disturbing, and the unorthodox. But what happens when a writer's ideas are an affront to you or offend you? What if you find the expression of certain thoughts objectionable? We can and should discuss these issues in class. We should be interested in developing critical thought in confronting what we might prefer to avoid. We should engage in issues that might be comfortable to ignore. Roth occasionally shocks us, but to shock may be the way to open us to ideas that are difficult. If you elect to take this course, I continued, bear in mind that we will inevitably deal with what all serious literature, especially fiction, treats, namely issues which by their nature are disturbing, troubling, either in the fictional situations, in the characters' stated values, or in the language with which their thought and actions are expressed. Here is a passage from Kafka's diaries, which influenced Roth and is an important statement pertaining to any profound and complex work of literature. And this is what Kafka said. Altogether, I think we ought to read only books that bite and sting us. If the book does not shake us like a blow to the skull, why bother reading it at all? So that it can make us happy, we'd be just as happy if we had no books at all. What we need are books that hit us like a most profound misfortune, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, that make us feel as though we had been banished to the woods, far from any human presence. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. It's quite a stunning statement, I think. Now I'm going on a little more with what I said. I will not be giving you trigger warnings either in the syllabus or in class, other than to remark in a very general way that Roth's fiction presents complex and potentially disturbing matters, including, among other themes, heterosexual male desire and behavior, homosexual male desire and behavior, heterosexual female desire and behavior, infidelity, violence, critiques of Israeli politics, racial politics and prejudice, anti-Semitism, disease, depression, contemplation of suicide and death. This is a literature course, not a therapy session, and while, of course, your own emotional and psychological life inevitably enter into your reading and thinking about works, and while issues surrounding your own identity cannot be excluded from the reading process, we will be focusing on literary matters, structures of novels, how plots unfold, nature of character, and so on, keeping in mind that the characters in books do not necessarily represent, and this is, I think, a very important point, the characters do not necessarily represent Roth's own views. And if a literature professor were to say, be forewarned, on page 245, the protagonist dies a terrible death, gird your loins for that. This would interfere with a well-crafted book whose structure may be designed deliberately to surprise or shock. The literary experience often depends on not knowing or anticipating something in advance, but seeing and understanding how the writer or narrator wants us to respond to an event we might not have predicted. This is known as suspense, and it is part of how fiction operates. I then went on to talk about the services that Reed provides in its counseling and psychology services for students who have genuine psychological difficulties, and I would recommend those students to that, but the classroom did not seem to me the place for that kind of therapy. Okay, what did I think the deepest appeal of Roth was for my students? Why was he successful? Why did the reading of these novels go so well when I was most worried that there would be heavy sledding in the future? I think the appeal was Roth's enormous range of subjects, including his forays into American social and political history, the way terror in any shape cannot be anticipated, and how the unforeseen is always ready to pounce. Certainly the students were deeply taken by The Human Stain, a book written in the summer of 1998, when, as Roth puts it, quote, an enormous piety binge, a purity binge, was set loose, and a virile, powerful, youthful, middle-aged president and a brash, smitten 20-year-old intern carrying on in the Oval Office like two teenagers in a parking lot revived America's oldest communal passion, historically perhaps its most treacherous and subversive pleasure, the ecstasy of sanctimony, end quote. And sanctimony is exactly what advocates of trigger warnings often fall back on. For Reed students, at least those who are in my course and who are inherently skeptical and anti-authoritarian, Roth seemed to speak intensely to them. Roth commits what he calls serious mischief, taking pleasure in attacking high-minded orthodoxies, genteel sensibilities, and restrictions and restraints of all kinds. His characters act out their outrage with great verbal energy, gusto, impiety, and exuberance. As a satirist, Roth critiques intolerance, mass hysteria, and repression. My students constantly discussed how, in Roth's plots, the author shows that what marks us as a species is not high-minded purpose, but our more basic cravings. In class, we analyzed how his novels explore the cost to the characters when their ordinary needs are saddled with high purpose, dictated by the world or by obligations that they internalize that can turn them against themselves. Perhaps Reed students enjoy being contrarians, impelled almost by instinct to go counter to others who might object to certain works of literature as too difficult or too disturbing. Most Reedies, as I have learned over the years, crave difficulty. Take to it like, well, ducks in water. I had momentarily dodged the trigger warning bullet, but I continue to be apprehensive in my experience with Measure for Measure, the Shakespeare play I mentioned, and the experiences of numerous colleagues concern me. Let me turn, in conclusion, to one of the issues I fretted most about before the course, and that is the accusation regarding Roth's misogyny. Perhaps no other American novelist, aside from Norman Mailer, has aroused such a firestorm of hostile commentary concerning the fictional representation of women and of male-female relations. My short answer to those attacks was to say that Roth often depicts very strong women, and conversely, that the men, his men, do not represent, as he puts it, quote, masculine power triumphant, but rather its antithesis, masculine power impaired. Roth says, I represent manhood stumbling, humbled, devastated. The men in my books are brought down by blurred moral vision, unworkable love, drastic loss, lunatic entanglements, misjudgment, illness, exhaustion, derangement, aging, dying. Men stunned by life that they are defenseless against. So I think we can regard Roth as not unlike the ancient Greek tragedians, an heir to Sophocles in asserting that we can never know when our expectations will be upended in the most unimagined ways possible. And here to close, I want to return for just a brief moment to trigger warnings. I am not suggesting that Roth is the equal of Sophocles, but Roth's themes are not so different from those occurring in Oedipus Rex. And so I think of those trigger-happy students who have felt very uncomfortable reading Oedipus Rex, that greatest of all Greek plays, a drama that is replete with parricide, mother-son incest, gory self-blinding, and suicide by hanging, a veritable quadrifecta of horror and discomfort. Confronting such a play with its scene-by-scene surprises and one traumatizing discovery after another, where shall we go? Into a safe room or into a provocative, galvanizing, challenging classroom? When we think about trigger warnings, we have to engage with a very serious question. Is this an important movement that urges sensitivity to victims of oppression of all kinds, or does it suggest a moment in contemporary culture that stresses self-indulgence, narcissism, and a fear of the complex world? As my avid students in the Philip Roth class often showed me, if readers approach difficult material with intelligence, sensitivity, and openness to discussion, real and serious education, not a retreatment from engagement, will take place. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your compelling arguments against trigger warnings. definitely news to me as someone who is not in academia and hasn't been for some time. Now for questions. If you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so a City Club staff member can come collect it for you. We'll take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question, as asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership. Membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member. Please ask only one question and ask your question as succinctly as possible. If I raise my hand, it means please wrap up your question. Please go ahead.
Uriel Lezak, a City Club member. Thank you, Professor Porter. I'm wondering whether anybody has thought of following this trigger-happy movement to its wonderful reductio ad absurdum level. Namely, shouldn't every newspaper carry a warning on the head? I'd appreciate your comments on that.
Well, you're probably exactly correct. It's an interesting issue as to whether how deeply this movement will spread into the culture at large, and that would certainly remind me of newspapers like Pravda and other papers where there is a very serious censorship by government bureaucracy to prevent readers from knowing certain things. So I mean, it's hard to imagine that happening here, but yet not utterly. I didn't mention there's a novel by Roth called The Plot Against America, in which he envisions a kind of fascist takeover of the United States during the campaign of 1940, when Roosevelt was running, and he imagines Charles Lindbergh becoming the Republican nominee for president and instituting a whole host of prohibitions about freedom. And so, I mean, Roth thought about those kinds of things. It's a dark vision that you're proposing. I certainly hope it never comes to fruition. Yeah.
My name is Zoe Klingman. I am a policy associate with City Club. So you described trigger warnings as a sort of a type of censorship. But if we can assume that nowadays colleges care about their students who are experiencing psychological trauma, couldn't you see trigger warnings as a better alternative to actual just censorship, just straight censorship? In other words, wouldn't you rather teach a book that has warnings on it than not teach the book at all?
Well, as I said, I mean, I think it creates an atmosphere in which people begin to look exactly for the things that they fear that will happen, that will occur in the text. I know from some experience that there was a faculty member at Reed who put trigger warnings on a set of lecture notes that he handed out, a kind of bibliography and an outline of a lecture. Before he delivered it, had a trigger warning, and he said any student who thinks he or she might be distressed by such passages that I'm going to quote or such themes I'm going to be talking about perhaps ought to make the choice not to hear my lecture. And I thought that was quite outrageous. I mean, students, a number of students left because they did not want to expose themselves to that kind of thematic or expressive material. And I really do think that it creates exactly the wrong perspective. I think it's quite all right to say, look, as I said about my course, look, there's difficult material here. And that feels to me as far as I would want to go with that, to warn them about a particular text and to say, here is where something happens that you might not want to address or you might want to be forewarned. I think that creates a very specific orientation to it, and I'd much rather have the students come at it on their own terms.
Hello, Amanda Shore, City Club member. Thank you for speaking with us today. I think any argument carried down its slippery slope becomes quite silly. The main character dies on page 42 is obviously not something that any of us want. However, There's a statistic that has been quoted by both the president and the vice president that 1 in 5 women on college campuses will be raped before they leave that college campus. Does it at all change your perspective of offering a warning before the class, hello, today we will be dealing with sexual assault, if you're aware that possibly 1 in 5 women in that classroom might have been sexually assaulted that year, that month, or even that week?
Look, I know those statistics, and I think they're real, and I think it's a dreadful fact. And I think colleges have not done nearly enough to educate students in, I'm going to use a term that could be thought about in many different ways, into proper, respectful behavior in all situations. I think colleges need to do a lot more, and as you probably know, Title IX mandates that colleges now take into consideration policies which will hopefully alleviate the kind of statistics that or reduce dramatically the kind of statistics you're talking about. As far as the classroom is concerned, I suppose I have no great objection to saying, well, this is a book which deals with these things, but I would not want to say, and you should choose to be in the classroom or not. I think if you have those problems, the place to settle those or deal with those problems as best one can is in therapy. That's what counseling is for. The classroom, I think, and I agree. I mean, I think it is I think the slippery slope is once you begin a kind of overprotection, you really make it very difficult for students to confront issues which are worth talking about. We all have suffered, and I'm not trying to equate the experience of sexual assault and abuse with any other experience, but everybody has experienced some difficulties and trauma in their lives by the time they're 18. I think very few people, and I was going to say fortunate, but maybe they're not even so fortunate if they have escaped those experiences. Does that mean that nothing should be read that might have the danger of provoking some kind of re-traumatizing experience? I don't think so.
Professor, we'll take a question from the floor. How would this type of process apply to the K-12 education system as opposed to just college campuses?
That's hard. I mean, I have never taught in public school, in K through 12, and so I don't feel, haven't thought about it, frankly. And I guess I'm going to dodge that question, really. I mean, I'm sure, I think it's probably enormously important. It is enormously important. But I'm really feeling that I'm not the right person to ask about that. And, if anybody in the audience has, if you have a little dialogue on this issue, if there's anybody who either teaches in public school or has had experience along these lines, I'd be very interested to hear about it. I have not read much, I've not read anything about the way that kind of phenomena would work with much younger children. So I don't know, is there anybody?
We'll let you off the hook on that one.
You're gonna let me off the hook. I'm dodging that bullet.
Okay, back to the microphone.
Chris Andre, City Club member. Thank you so very, very much. People need to hear this again and again and again. How did we arrive at this juncture? How did we come to a point where we're demanding safety from the world of the intellect, the world of literature, the world of words? I remember we used to sneak copies of Portnoy's complaint from our parents, in the drawer under the bed or something. This is what we wanted. We wanted to be challenged. We wanted to hear things that we didn't know about and hadn't heard before. How did we arrive at this point? And how do we get away from it? It's poison.
Well, as I say, I think we arrived at it. I really do think that the internet is a contributing factor in this. I mean, people are, there were a lot of blogs that have been written in the last 7, 8 years, in which chat rooms in which people discuss their experiences. And I think that may be enormously therapeutic to do that. And so I think that as I say, most people who write about this issue have concluded that there is, it is very easy for one to go from feeling unburdened by talking about these issues, and ironically, I mean, to talking about these issues, to not wanting to talk about these issues in a classroom. And, you know, I think one of the implications of your question might be whether the classroom should be a place for people who are willing to talk about those issues, those personal issues, whether we should do that in the classroom. Not censor the reading, but talk about the issues. And you know, while I don't want to turn a classroom into a therapy session, I think one can raise those issues a bit, and certainly I believe that that it's important for people's own personal identities to have some bearing on the way they read texts. How much discussion of that kind of thing should happen is a complex question, but I don't think the class, I think that this issue has come up largely because of the easy access to learning about other people's difficulties on the internet.
Hi, I'm Garrison Cox. I'm a City Club Civic Associate. I'm wondering if you think there's any way for professors to respond to legitimate psychological issues in the classroom without jeopardizing or creating a culture of avoidance of important academic learning topics.
Well, look, let me give you an example. I mean, I mentioned the measure for measure moment. If that student had come to me and said, I can't talk about this material in class, I can't write a paper about it, could I write about a different topic? I think I probably would have been willing to do that. I might have also said, why don't you come, if you can't speak about it in class, why don't you come to my office hours and we can talk one-on-one if you're comfortable doing that. If the question is that you don't want to talk about it in a public way, we can speak about it together, or you can write something on a different topic, or even on that topic if you're comfortable with it after having discussed it together. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to make the classroom a therapist office, but I'm willing to make accommodations if a student really needs to find a different venue or a different avenue for expression. Yeah.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. Is there any effort that you're aware of to redefine safe space in a classroom to being one where it is safe to discuss, expand your horizons, and actually be educated?
That's nice. That's a different way of talking about safety. I mean, I think that's what classrooms have always been. I mean, I haven't heard them called safe spaces. I mean, that term has been used mostly for retreats from the, you know, the firefight of the classroom, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. You know, I think classrooms need to be safe in that regard, but not in terms of avoidance of the serious intellectual issues. Yeah.
Professor, we'll take another index card question. Are trigger warnings an issue of the privileged?
That's an interesting question. There has, that was a written question. Yeah. Could I get a clarification from the person who wrote that about what they mean by that?
Class or race.
Okay, class or race. It's a friend of mine here who asked that question, and a colleague. I don't see it so much as that. I mean, I think trigger warnings have the requests for trigger warnings have come from people in a whole range of social economic situations, different racial situations. The person who was so outraged by the measure for measure topic is a gay woman. I mean, is she privileged? She probably would think she's marginalized, and that this only re-marginalized her or excessively marginalized her. So I mean, I don't see that it's a privileged issue, unless you meant something different by that.
Thanks, Professor. Back to the microphone.
Chris Moore, member, married to a Reedy and child not of helicopter parents. Is your attorney Atticus Finch? And I almost hesitate to ask, but
which incarnation of Atticus Finch?
Exactly.
The first or second?
Exactly.
Yeah. He happens to be he happens to be you don't want an answer. No, I'll tell you. He happens to be a kind of left-wing lawyer, so he's closer to Atticus I than Atticus II, I suppose. Yeah.
Les Volstek, City Club member. In the announcement from the City Club itself about today's topic, it said, "Want to know a bit more about this debate? Read, I will not be giving you trigger warnings by Roger Porter, and Trigger Happy, a professor examines why he's pro-trigger warnings by Angus Johnston." Professor, I didn't read these assignments. What I want to know is, can you summarize the second work, which is apparently supportive of trigger warnings, for the sake of those of us in the audience
Yeah,
who did not read it?
Yeah, you heard a version of. I mean, you heard the first one in my talk. It's the second one, the pro trigger warnings little essay was very short. I think it was just 2 pages. And as I read it very quickly, didn't find it particularly illuminating, and it just makes all the arguments that I think I have made, that it is a protective way of keeping students from confronting difficult experience. I mean, there was really nothing in it that rose to the level of, incredibly sophisticated opposition. So, I don't think that. I mean, you've heard in my talk mostly the kind of oppositions that she writes about. So nothing terribly new about it. Really.
And briefly, our final question.
Marvin Gordon Lickey, City Club member. You mentioned your speculation about the role of the internet communications in developing this culture of protection. But we've also heard a lot in recent decades about the overprotectiveness of child rearing in this generation, more so than in previous times. Do you think that this overprotective child rearing can feed into this mentality?
I really do think so. Because, I mean, if you assume that one of the factors going into that kind of protective child rearing is something that prevents autonomy, independence, making one's own decisions about the world, and particularly decisions that might seem to a parent dangerous or threatening in some ways. So I think it's exactly the kind of thing that is set up by the trigger warning movement. And someone mentioned helicopter parents. I think that's probably related in an interesting, complex way to this phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you for the great questions today. We've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. This is Courtney Nelson, President-elect of City Club. Please join me in thanking Professor Roger Porter. We're adjourned.